Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to the wild Vaughn Manor. And today, it's Wednesday, which means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, I'll talk about a comic book, a graphic novel, or a comic book subject. Steve Donoghue over at his channel will talk about the same comic book, or the same graphic novel, or the same comic book subject. It is our world's finest team-up that we do once a week. But if you see my duds, you also know that it's also June on the Range, an event here on BookTube where we focus on Western fiction. Well, today's comic fits the bill because it is a Western comic book, perhaps the most famous Western character ever to appear in an American comic book. Today, we'll be talking about that character. Now, when I was a kid back in the 70s, my brother and I, some of our favorite comic books were non-superhero comic books. And they had a lot of good ones back when we were kids. They had DC Comics had the War Comics. They had Sergeant Rock, which was fantastic. They had Enemy Ace. They had The Unknown Soldier. DC Comics also was doing the Tarzan comic book at the time. For a while, they did Tarzan. Had some other stuff based on Edgar Rice Burroughs that was pretty good. And they also did Western comic books, and their most famous Western character was this one. This is Jonah Hex. Jonah Hex. Now, Jonah Hex was particularly popular on my block. Conan the Barbarian and Jonah Hex were probably two of the most popular comic books, the ones that got traded around the most by us little kids. And it's no surprise because this is incredibly violent, Jonah Hex. You know, the children love that kind of thing. So, Jonah Hex, this particular volume is the Weird Western Tales volume. It's not an omnibus. They were going to make an omnibus, then because it's DC and they're dopey, they decided to make a hardcover that was smaller, and they just focused on the Jonah Hex adventures from Weird Western Tales. Jonah Hex originally appeared in 1972 in the comic book's All-Star Western. After only a couple issues of Jonah Hex being in that comic, though, he started headlining the comic, and the comic became Weird Western Tales, starring Jonah Hex. Because Jonah Hex, yeah, they had a hit on their hands with this character. As you can see, Jonah Hex is not the prettiest fella you'll ever see, with his horrifically scarred face, something that entertained us children quite a bit. He still had his Confederate outfit on. He was an ex-Confederate soldier. And for a living, he's a bounty hunter. You definitely want your main character in your Western comic to be a bounty hunter. You know, just for the extra violence. So, this was a very popular comic book for a while. And Jonah Hex was published after he left Weird Western Tales. He got his own title. I think Scalp Hunter, one of their other characters, Scalp Hunter, he took over Weird Western Tales, I believe. And Jonah Hex went to his own comic. And that comic lasted, I think, almost up until Crisis on Infinite Earths, and it had a very strange... This comic had a very strange ending, which I'll get to. But this comic book character, Jonah Hex, he was created by John Albano and Tony DeZuniga. And Tony DeZuniga is important, not just because he's a really good comic book artist, and he is. He's one of my favorites from this period. He was the first Filipino comic book artist to be hired by a major American comic book publisher. And his work paved the way for other Filipino artists to have their work published in major American comics. So he was kind of a groundbreaking artist in that way, and his artwork is excellent, and it's particularly suited to a Western comic book, as you shall see. Very, very dark comic book, Jonah Hex. It was inspired in part, at least, by the spaghetti westerns, which were popular at the time. Spaghetti westerns, which were Western films made in Italy by people who had no knowledge of American history or American geography, but they were fun movies, and they had a lot of influence on both American film and on this particular Western comic book. This is basically a spaghetti Western in comic book form. It has a bunch of kind of the Western stereotypes that you'll find in here. Its depiction of Native American characters was pretty much straight out of the 1950s. The fact that the main character is an ex-Confederate who still wears his uniform, I suppose, is problematic in itself. But at the time, none of us questioned any of that stuff because, you know, it was the early 70s and we were just used to stuff like that. So, Jonah Hex's career began in Weird Western Tales. This is a very nice book. As much as I rag on DC Comics for their stupid reprint program, and it is pretty dumb, when they get around to actually publishing something, very often they do a pretty good job. And they did a very nice job with this book. It's a beautifully printed book. It's just gorgeous. Now this is the Weird Western, actually no, this is All-Star Western. Jonah Hex started in All-Star Western, and this is his first appearance. And in this appearance, of course, he's dragging dead bodies down the street, so it's already starting out right, you know. And you'll see that the artwork by Tony DeZuniga is already really good, and you get that Western sense from this. This is the type of comic book he was really good at. And of course, the violence starts right away. You definitely want that, at least by page 3. You know, in your story, you want some folks being shot to death, and by goodness, you get it. His characters, DeZuniga's characters, did tend to look like actual human beings, which was nice. And even more interesting is that his characters very often looked like specific human beings. Like, we get a guest appearance, uncredited guest appearance by Lee Marvin. You'll notice Lee Marvin there, guest starring, uncredited, in this issue of Jonah Hex. This is where Jonah Hex finally reveals his ghastly face to horrify the villains, and sometimes people who are not villains. He's just all around horrifying. And this this first story, this shows you how dark a character Jonah Hex is. He had to take off his guns because the villain was holding his gun up to this woman. And so as soon as the villain rides away, he takes out a knife out of the back of his shirt, and he stabs the villain in the back. In the back, he stabs him. You know, this is not one of those goody two-shoes cowboys. No way. This is Jonah Hex. Very dark character. Again, excellent artwork. He does a great job with all of the Western characters that inhabit Jonah Hex's Western world. A lot of these covers were excellent, and I have to say that I was able, even before I picked up this book, just to remember all of these covers for years. This is, I remember this cover from years ago. I had a tattered used copy of this, which I had bought at a garage sale or something. I bought a lot of old Jonah Hex comics because when I was reading them, they were already a few years old. And I bought a lot of used comics at like garage sales and antique stores, or just wherever I could find them. There were not a ton of comic book stores at the time. They were around, but there wasn't a ton of them. Again, some excellent violent artwork from Jonah Hex. And I believe, where is it? We get another guest appearance in here. This is the guest appearance by Lee Van Cleef. There's Lee Van Cleef there, who is famous from A Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. He makes an uncredited guest appearance here in Jonah Hex. So about half the book, almost, is illustrated by Tony DeZuniga. Eventually, he is replaced by some different artists, and Michael Fleischer takes over the scripting. I liked the earlier stories in this probably a bit better because they were just kind of like Jonah Hex has this one little adventure and he's out. Where some of the other adventures, they go on for a bit. They're not quite exactly like that, which I liked from this comic book, but they were not bad. Some of them were a little ridiculous. I will admit that, but you know what? That's okay. A lot of great moments from Jonah Hex. So this volume, like I said, only contains the stories from Weird Western Tales. Jonah Hex, like I said, continued on into his own comic book. From what I remember, from when I was getting this comic, the later Jonah Hex stories were not as good as the earlier ones. But you know what? I haven't read any of these for decades. Picking up this, I was wondering, is this going to hold up to my memories of this character? For the most part, it does. Being older, you can see some of the things in it that aren't so great. But overall, it's a very entertaining comic book. And it's an important comic book just because this character is such a well-known DC Comics character. Probably because he's like the only DC Comics Western character that survived for any length of time. He survived to make a really, really terrible movie. And it was terrible, but I knew it was going to be terrible. It seems like it would be hard to make a good Jonah Hex movie. And he also showed up on a show called Legends of Tomorrow. Yeah, he showed up on one of those Arrowverse shows, Legends of Tomorrow, as a nicer version of this character. This character was interesting because he was such a dark character who just slaughtered people all the time. I don't know if anybody ever made a calculation of how many people Jonah Hex killed in his comic books, but man, that's going to be a pretty high tally. In real life, he'd be a billionaire from just all the bounties that he got. But he was a very dark character, and they had some issues, I think, about this character being not only an ex-Confederate character, but an ex-Confederate character still wandering around in his Confederate uniform. Even at the time, it was like... So they tried to come up with a storyline where, like, well, he was really against slavery. You see, when he was a kid, his evil dad, his dad was pretty bad from what I remember, sold him into slavery to some Native Americans. And for a while, he was a slave of these Native Americans before he saved the chief or something and became a member of the tribe. So he was actually against slavery, and yet he inexplicably, despite being so against slavery, decided to fight for the Confederacy anyway, and was so on board with them that he kept his outfit on even after the war was over. So, I don't know, maybe buy another outfit, but that's just me. Otherwise, this comic was pretty cool for kind of a spaghetti western comic book, which is really what this is. It's a spaghetti western comic book that probably lasted too long. Probably, like I said, the best of this guy's adventures can be found in this volume. By the 80s, when his comic finally ended, he went to a series which I think was a limited series called Hex, where he was transported into the future of the 21st century, which of course is a post-apocalyptic wasteland, and Hex has to fight off mutants and monsters and stuff in the future. Eventually he gets back to his own time to have further adventures in different Jonah Hex series. One of the interesting things about this series is that it was called Weird Western Tales when there really wasn't too much weird about it, other than the fact that Jonah Hex looked pretty creepy. It wasn't a supernatural series at all. There were no monsters. Until there were some later Jonah Hex series. One that was written by Joe R. Lansdale, who was a pretty good novelist. He came up with a series of Jonah Hex adventures, which were really creepy and had a bunch of zombies and monsters in it. And so there were a few different Jonah Hex series over the years. The quality varied. Let's just put it that way. Again, my personal feeling is the best Jonah Hex is not just the early Jonah Hex, but the earlier stuff in this book. The stuff by Tony DeZuniga and John Albano is probably, in my mind, the best Jonah Hex stuff, although the other stuff in here is pretty entertaining. So yeah, Jonah Hex, I guess that's all I have to say about it. You can check out Steve Donoghue's channel if you want to hear how terrible this is, because I'm sure he'll, in fact, I know he thinks this is terrible. That's pretty par for the course for Steve Donoghue. He likes superhero comics from DC and not too much else. So, yeah, check out Steve Donoghue. He'll tell you that this is terrible, but I liked it. I thought this was a good, entertaining read. So there you go. Jonah Hex. I've got another June on the Range video coming up fairly soon. It should be up there somewhere. Focusing on some Louis L'Amour novels I read. So I will catch you next time.